the older ones still work. Hello, Bob, N6TV here, San Jose, California. All right, so this talk is everything you really need to know about USB and serial interfaces. If you want to mute yourself, that would help the listeners. I'll now proceed. So here's the overview real quick, a little bit brief history of what legacy serial ports looked like and how we've all moved on to USB ones, but our radios and devices still have serial ports, so we need some USB to serial adapters. The Windows Device Manager is key to understanding how to manage all your serial ports and make it work right. And you can also use serial ports with for CW and FSK and PTT keying of your radio from a computer program, which is a real cool way to go if you're using logging software like N1MM or any of the others. Sometimes you need to share two devices on the same serial port, and I'll talk about how you can do that. And of course, a USB connection also gives you a sound card, and you'd use that with FT8 and other modes these days. And then we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. But if you want to unmute yourself and ask me a question in the middle of the presentation, feel free. This is a preview of the talk I'll be giving at Dayton Contest University. So this is my dry run through. So originally there was a 25-pin serial connector. It was male, actually. This is a female one indicating a parallel port. And then this one down here is correctly called a DE9, not a DB9. That's a legacy serial port. The letter refers to the size of the shell. So this is a DB shell and this is a DE shell. You can have a 15-pin one in the same size, and that'd be a VGA connector. So the correct term is DE9, not DB9. There's no such thing technically. In the old days, life was really simple. Radios had serial ports on them. I'm not aware of any modern radio that had 25-pin serial port, but so half the manufacturers, Elecraft and ICOM, on just two of their radios used a female connector, and Yaesu and Kenwood used a male connector and mounted it upside down because that's where the board is, above the connector. But then they improved our computers, and all of our friendly real serial ports like COM1 and COM2 and LPT1, they went away, and they're all replaced by USB ports, which was the problem because until recently, radios and devices still had 9-pin serial ports. And to this day, peripherals, quite a few of them, still require a 9-pin serial port to work. This includes a lot of automatic linear amplifiers from ICOM, SPE, Elecraft, RF kit. They all want to get data from the radio through a serial port. Remote big boxes don't work with USB directly. You need a serial port there. And some rotator controllers, and of course the step IR antenna controllers don't talk USB, they want serial ports, as do some band decoders. So the solution we've all got is USB to serial adapters. And just briefly, here's what USB ports look like. You're probably all familiar with them. The blue ones, they're not always blue, but they might have an SS for super speed label on them. They're the type 3 or USB 3.0, which is higher speed, but not really needed for anything. The only radio I know that has a type B USB connector, a 3.0, like this one down here, is the ICOM IC7610, and it's not used for rig control. It's just used for high-speed data for the scope or digitized band. So you don't need to use the blue connector on the 7610 when you're trying to control it. There's a wide variety of USB to serial adapters. I'm going to list these here in the order of sort of the most compatible versions. First would be the edge port. I'll show some pictures of that in a minute. It's very stable, and MMTTY can open those virtual serial ports directly at the 45.5 baud, which most USB to serial adapters cannot. Then you have the Ultima ones. They're included in the microham interfaces. Also, I think BSP Manager uses it. FTDI serial ports are excellent, very stable, but they can't be opened directly by MMTTY. And Elecraft has those built into their devices, including their two transceivers and their KPA 1500 amplifier. Then Kenwood and Yaesu and ICOM, they use a different device driver from Silicon Labs. It works very well as well. And the one you want to avoid is anything made by Prolific, because over the years, it's been counterfeited and copied, and the device drivers will turn the thing into a brick if it's not genuine, and it just causes, even if you have a genuine one and a genuine device driver, it doesn't play well with other serial ports on the systems. And I've debugged no end of problems simply by getting the owner to throw away their prolific and uninstall the device driver. So stay away from prolific, please. Here's what the Digi International EdgePort 4 looks like. It's hard to obtain. It's very expensive new. You can find them on eBay, and sometimes W0YK has these available as he collects some used ones. He might have some left. The beauty of them is you just plug them in and Windows finds them, and you got 4 serial ports. You don't need any power connector. They also made an 8-port one. It's just nice if you have a whole bunch of rotator controllers, like 8 rotators, a big station, and you need 8 of those. I see something in the chat here. Oh, that's something else. Okay, wrong Bob. Amy says. No, it looks like I'm off the hook for next month. Thanks, Amy. So the easier ones to get, you can get these on Amazon. The Stark makes a 4-port. They're all FTDI ports, but they have a separate 5-volt power supply. If you're at Tim's station, all switching power supplies are banned, and you can still find 5-volt linear supplies if you look hard enough. StarTech makes an 8-port one, and it's also very good and uses FTDI. Then, of course, we have the high-end microham M2R Plus, which sort of does it all. Not only does it give you any number of serial ports virtually that you need to connect to your radio, it also provides sound cards, 2 of them, one for voice keying, one for recording, and some analog knobs for tuning it. And it uses the Ultimate ones. And their router software is the interface to create the virtual serial ports. But if you're not going to spend that much money, because that thing's like over $700 or $800 now, and all you need is a couple of serial ports, this is one way to go. The prices are starting to go up, as is everything, but the Gizmo and the FTDI Chip EX10 are excellent USB to serial adapters. And as you can see from this Gizmo down here, with one USB connector, you get 4 independent serial ports and the FTDI drivers. Those are available on Amazon. The FTDI is available from DigiKey and I think Mouser. The one you want to avoid, as I mentioned, is the prolific. It often looks like this. Sometimes you can get a good one that looks like this. It has an FTDI chip in it. But if they don't tell you that it's FTDI, then it's very cheap, then it's probably prolific. If it's costing you less than $15 or it's a ham special, I would stay away from it unless they can plug it in and see that it is indeed an FTDI device. Their device driver interferes with other ones on the system and makes things very unstable. Like it'll work for a little while and then it just quits and you have to start it over again. When you connect the USB to serial adapter, most of the time you can, if it's FTDI or an Elecraft box or an edge port, you can just plug it right into the PC, and Windows 10 or 11, or I think even Windows 7 and on will automatically detect it and install the right device driver. You don't need a separate disk or to download a driver from a website. The COM port numbers, Windows figures out which COM port number to use when it sees a new device. And then you can use the Windows Device Manager to see what COM port number it got assigned to. One thing to watch out for, though, is if you move a USB cable to a different port on your PC, a different USB port, or you move it to an external hub, or even if you just move it to a desktop PC between like a USB 2.0 connector and a USB 3.0 connector, you're going to find your COM port numbers just got changed. Well, why is that? Well, Windows identifies the device by the hub that it was connected to, and PCs have one or more internal hubs, or you could have an external one. So just moving to a different connector, especially if the PC has like 6 or 7 or 8 USB ports, just moving the cable to a new connector can cause the COM port number to change. You can fix that. I'll show you how to do that. But for consistency, once you got the COM port number figured out, make a note of which connector you're using on your PC and always plug the USB cable into there. But if you have a radio like an ICOM or a Yaesu or a Kenwood with a USB port, or the microham controllers, it's very important that before you ever connect that USB cable, you want to install the manufacturer's device driver. Usually go to their website and download the latest version for the best compatibility. If you don't do that, you're going to end up with something in your device manager called unknown device. You can recover from this. You have to unplug the cable, show the hidden devices, uninstall that device, then install the driver, and then everything will work the next time you plug it in. And again, COM port numbers are going to be figured out by Windows, but you can change COM port numbers. So there's a couple of ways of starting the Windows Device Manager. You can right-click on the Windows Start button, and there'll be a Device Manager entry in the pop-up list. Well, my favorite shortcut is to hold down the Windows key like a Shift key and then tap the letter R for run. And when the little run box comes up, just type in devmanagement.msc, and it remembers that command the next time. You don't have to type all that in. If you're running a version of Windows before Windows 10, then you have to set an environment variable to actually see everything in the device manager. I have these slides in here for reference, so I'm going to just skip over them pretty quickly because I think most folks are running Windows 10 or later at this point. But if you aren't running Windows 10, you need to create an environment variable. You go edit the system environment variables, you go to the advanced tab, you click on the environment variable button, and you click the new button, and then you type in the string exactly and set it to number 1. And once you've done all that, now you can start the Windows Device Manager and see the hidden devices. So how do you do that? Well, every time you start the Device Manager, you have to go View, Show Hidden Devices. That will show you all the COM port numbers that were ever assigned on your system. And if you look down here, I enable that option, and then I see right here, there's a gray icon. That means that COM5 USB to serial adapter is not plugged in right now. My edge port's plugged in. I got 4 COM ports from that, but this one is not plugged in. And that's what you would not see if you don't check this box. And unfortunately, it's not sticky. Every time you start the Device Manager, you have to say View, Show Hidden Devices. I recently discovered that you can kind of create your own Device Manager shortcut that turns that on, but I don't have that in these slides. Kind of complicated, but I made it work. Once you find a hidden device, you want to right-click on it and then select Properties, as I've highlighted there, so you can see what Device Manager it's using. In this case, it says right here on the Driver tab, it's an FTDI, so all is good. But you see prolific there, you want to click this Uninstall Device button. You don't want to have any prolific devices hanging around, even if they're not even plugged in anymore. And if it is prolific, you want to check this box, which is the next thing that comes up. I want to delete the driver for the software. You don't even want the prolific driver to be on your system because it will interfere with stuff. There's another tab over there, because even if it's FTDI, you're kind of not done yet. You need to go to the Port Settings tab up here and then click this Advanced button down here, because the default FTDI options are not very good. If you've enabled keying of your radio on RTS or DTR pins, which is a very convenient way to just use one USB cable for CW and PT keying, unless you change the default options, you're going to have your radio keyed about 6 or 7 times every time you connect the USB cable or reboot your PC. You might have heard that on the air. A signal goes da 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 da. That's this classic sound of a FTDI driver that hasn't had its default options checked. So you want to uncheck serial enumerator, and you want to check disable modem control at startup, then click OK. And what that does is it prevents Windows from looking for a serial mouse. Nobody uses a mouse with a serial connector on it anymore. And it's also going to make it stop looking for a dial-up modem, and that will prevent it from sending unwanted commands at boot time. So here's what I'm showing you and zoomed in here. Uncheck serial enumerator, disable modem control at startup. This only applies to FTDI devices, and you can do it safely on every one that you have. Unfortunately, when a Windows update comes along once a year or so, it updates the FTDI driver, or if you manually update the driver, you're going to find all these options set back to their defaults. My friend Max, NG7M, has written a program that will go through your registry and uncheck all these things for you if you have a whole bunch of FTDI ports. It's a little easier than doing one at a time. So contact Max, November Golf 7 Mike, if you want a little program that'll do it for you. If you're got an older desktop PC, let's say with a real serial legacy serial ports on them, like COM1 and COM2, they can also Windows will also look for a modem and a mouse on those. So I'm going to just skip this pretty quickly, but you can edit the registry. There's the key, and you can rename a key, and then it won't key on those COM ports anymore, except when you want it to. So here's how you save the registry before you make any changes. In the device manager, you'll locate something called the device instance path, and then you can rename this key in the registry, upper filters, rename it old upper filters, and now you will no longer have serial enumeration. Remember that? You won't have that happening on your legacy serial ports anymore. They won't key your radio except when you want it to. Final step to remember is that Windows by default is trying to save energy for Energy Star compliance or something. So if you look at every USB hub under this Universal Serial Bus Controllers entry in your device manager, right click on each one and select Properties and go to the Power Management tab and make sure you uncheck this box that says allow the computer to turn off this device to save power. The last thing you want in a station is to have Windows turning off devices that it thinks you're not using. So uncheck that box on every USB hub. I think those are the main ones that have a power management tab. The other devices won't have it. There's another tool around besides the device manager. Actually, there's multiple ones. Here's one I'm vaguely familiar with called the USBDeview or device viewer. And you can go to this web page to download it for free, but you have to scroll way down to the bottom of the page before you can finally find these download links. They've really buried it in the feedback section for some reason. And here's a screenshot of what it looks like. One of the convenient things that it has on it is the last plug and unplug date. You can sort by this column. That's a tip for Windows if most folks don't know this. If you have a table view in any kind of device view, in any kind of file manager, the details view, and you see a column heading up here, just click on the column heading and a little arrow will appear indicating that you're now sorting the whole table by that column. So if I clicked over here, it would sort by the last plug and unplug date. Each time you click, it toggles between ascending and descending. So that's a tip for you Windows users. Whenever you see a list like this, just click on the title bar of that column and it'll sort by that column. So what about managing the COM port numbers? Because, you know, things get really big. If you try devices, you unplug and you never delete any devices, even though you recycled them years ago. There's hogging COM port numbers. And there's some software, like until recently, WinTest wouldn't support a COM port number higher than 13 in their dialogues. So one I suggest is just to try to lay out your COM port numbers sequentially, or even stick labels on each device that says this is on COM3, this is on COM4, this rotator's on COM5, etc. And you can renumber your ports sort of match your station layout. But first thing you want to do is, as I showed before, uninstall all those devices that are hidden and no longer used, and that way that frees up that COM port number to be used by what you really want it to be used by. You want to right click on the remaining COM ports and select Properties, Port Settings tab, and then you click the Advanced button. Sorry about that. I did try to mute all my phones, but that one, the base station doesn't mute for some reason. So let me show you how that works. So once you go to the Advanced tab, you can renumber your COM ports. So right here, for an FTDI one, remember this is the dialog where I was unchecking these boxes. It just has the COM port number that it's assigned to, and you can pick any of these other ones and renumber the COM port and click OK. Do that while you have no programs running, because if you have a program running and using that COM port, Windows is going to say, oh, this will take effect the next time you reboot. So if you close all the programs first and then renumber your COM ports, then it won't bug you to reboot Windows to make it go into effect. But you notice back here, it said in use on a couple of the COM ports. So what does that mean? It just means that the COM port number has been assigned to some device. Maybe it was years ago. It doesn't mean you can't use it. You can usually pick that an in-use COM port, and you can use it anyway, and you can ignore this warning message at the bottom that says, it's being used by another device, such as a COM port or modem. They got some really old messages in Windows. So it's safe to renumber your COM ports. You can usually ignore that. But if you uninstall the devices first, you won't have as much trouble with it complaining about the port is in use. Here's a trick that I recently discovered. I found a way to label what's on every COM port inside the device manager itself. It requires a registry edit, but you can actually label everything. And you can do it, with sound cards, and I'll show that later, but you can't use device manager to do this. You have to use the registry editor. But once you have figured out what all your COM ports are, you might lose that piece of paper. So it's nice to just put it into Windows so it labels it for you. So how do you do that? Well, you go to each COM port and you right click and go to properties and details, and then you go to this device instance path. Here's another Windows trick for you guys. When you see a big property list that has 100 things in it, you can just highlight it and tap the first letter of the thing you want to jump to. In this case, I tapped the letter D to jump down to the device instance path section. And it displays this big long string, and that big long string is what you're going to look for in the registry in a special key. So again, the Windows tip is if you have a drop-down list with a little arrow here, and you don't want to have to slowly scroll and click with the mouse, just while it's highlighted, tap the first letter of the thing you're looking for, and it jumps right to it. In the registry editor, you type regedit to launch that. You're looking for this key up here, and that sub key is in that big string. I know it's a little hard to read here, but right here inside the registry, you'll see this key that says FriendlyName. And that's where the string that you're seeing in Device Manager is. And you can edit that with the registry editor. Here's that big long string with the device instance path. And if you go into that, if you double click on that FriendlyName, I just add a string to the end that says it's my K4 serial number 73. Its first USB port. And unfortunately, though, if you renumber the serial port, if you do that step second instead of first, the name's going to change back to the default. So renumber first, then change your names. So sometimes you get into a situation where your software is running and it says, can I open COM3? And you're saying, well, nothing else is running. Why is COM3? Who's using COM3? Why can't I open COM3? Sometimes it's kind of a zombie process, a half-closed program that still had the port open. How do you figure out what program is opening and using that serial port? Why can't I get my program to run? So there's a free program from Microsoft called the Process Explorer. That link shows where you can download it. And I'll show you a screenshot here. There's a search button, and you can search for one of these strings if you kind of know what device you have. These are the partial strings that you want to look for. Every manufacturer shows different strings to look for. But if you search on the string, you can find out all the programs that are using, for example, the Edge port serial ports, or the Ultima or VSP Manager serial ports, or the ICOM or Kenwood serial port. So here's the Process Explorer screen. Here's that search icon I was telling you about. When I click that, this pop-up comes up, and I put in that partial string that I want to look for, and I hit search, and it tells me right here that this program has got that VCP0, that's a virtual COM port 0, open and is running. So either I have to kill that process if I want to use another program to use it, or I need to tell my program to use a different COM port. Here's another search where I did, and it discovered that OmniRig was using the serial port. OmniRig is a program used by Log4OM, and WSJTX has the option to use it, and some others. And it doesn't quite give up the serial port immediately when you close the program. It hangs around for a little while and then eventually lets it go. So that's why you were seeing OmniRig using the COM port. Even though you don't see OmniRig running, it can still run in the background and use it. Otherwise, it's a good program. But sometimes you're not quite sure what string to search for, but there is a special tool in the Process Explorer. It has this funny icon here. So you run a program that uses COM port that you're familiar with. Like I know COM3 is used by N1MM and it's working. Let me see what string that's called in case it's not working in the future. You just drag this icon right here and drag it on top of the N1MM screen, and then Process Explorer jumps to that process and tells you all the resources that it's using. You click on View, Lower Pane View, Handles. You only have to do that once. It remembers it. And then you can sort this by devices, and you can see right here device, you look through all these devices, hard disk, input, output. Ah, here's something that looks like a virtual COM port. So now you know that that's how the program refers to it. That's the handle that you want to search for next time you can't open the program to figure out who is using it. Switching gears a little bit here, let's talk a little bit about how to use your serial ports, virtual or real, to key CW or key RTTY, FSK, or key or PTT line. Nothing is what really made contesting easier in the last couple of decades was when K1EA came up with this and managed to figure out that you could key a radio with a parallel port or a serial port pin. So just to review for those who aren't real familiar with schematics, when this pin goes to a high voltage, that'll turn on this transistor and that will ground the key line, just like closing a straight key on your rig. Similarly, when voltage is on this pin, it's going to ground the PTT line of your rig and key your rig. So Elecraft said, well, why put this? You might remember W1WEF built this keying interface for many years that did that inside the little shell of the D-sub connector. But Elecraft said, we can put that inside the radio. We're not using those pins for RS-232 handshaking. And they were the first rig that I'm aware of that actually implemented that. And you do have to turn it on in the menu to say, I want to do PTT and CW keying by the RTS pin and the DTR pin, respectively. And this works well over a USB cable or a real serial port. You don't have to, you know, the timing is actually very good if you set your system up properly. You don't have to worry about, 1 millisecond jitter at the worst is about what you're going to see unless you have your system really overloaded and not configured right. But you do need to prevent those unwanted transmissions when you enable these options, because otherwise your PC can key your radio when you boot it, unless you've checked those FTDI options about serial enumerator and disable modem control at startup that I talked about earlier. The Elecraft K4 has a dialog for setting these things, and they have 3 serial ports on the rig. Here I've set up that I want to, on its first USB serial port, I want to do CW keying, and on the DTR pin, and I want to do PTT keying on the RTS pin. They also give you a second one. I set, can't see it, but if you scroll down, I've set my second one for FSK keying on DTR and RTS for PTT for MMTTY. Again, you have to remember to change the serial enumerator and disable modem control at startup. Well, what about other radios? Well, they got smart. They saw what Elecraft had done, and they did one step further. They added FSK RTTY keying as an option. That's something Elecraft didn't support except by their accessory connector. So all of these radios listed here, all these ICOM rigs support CW, PTT, and FSK via their virtual serial ports. The 705 and so on generate 2 virtual serial ports, but the 7300 just generates 1. And you need to work around that when you want to do 2 things with this the same port. I like to keep things simple and always use the DTR pin for my keying and the RTS pin for PTT, though the opposite would work if you prefer it for some reason. You definitely want to use your second port for MMTTY RTTY. I don't know if anybody on this list is into operating FSK RTTY, but it wants its own COM port. It won't share COM port with your logging software. Here's my little trick for remembering what's what. These letters are close to each other in the alphabet, C, D, F, and RTS for PTT and S, those are close together in the alphabet. So that's how I remember what goes on RTS and what goes on CW, or on DTR. Sometimes when you plug in an ICOM rig, it's going to create 2 COM ports. They refer to them as COM A and B, and usually they're in the right order, like COM 5 and COM 6, but they might be the opposite depending on what COM port numbers it reused. And rig control only works on the first one. It doesn't work on the second one. So you got to figure out what port A is. How do you do that? Again, you go to the device manager, you go to the details tab, you go to that friendly device instance path. And for ICOM rigs, the last letter of this big long string tells you what's port A and what's port B. So I'm going to skip through these slides pretty quickly because it's the same idea. It's just everybody's got a different menu for setting up their radios. The 7300 It's the set connectors menu, USB keying CW DTR, USB keying RTTY, or you can set it to RTTY keying DTR. But if you do that, your logging program is not going to be able to use it. So that's what I'm making a note of down here. If you aren't doing RTTY keying on the COM port of the 7300, you'll need a CT17 or equivalent to do rig control on the CIV port. That only applies to 7300 because it's the only ICOM rig that just generates one virtual serial port. 705, I'll just skip through this quickly. I don't know if anybody on this list has one, but their menus are a little different. And for your reference, this is the menu options to enable those keying. Here's the 7610, again, a little different. They have USB 1A and USB 1B because the USB 2 is that blue one I talked about earlier. That blue connector isn't used for this keying stuff. And in MMTTY for RTTY, you want to use EXT-FSK. One of the limitations of ICOM rigs is that you can't have more than one port set for PTT. So you might want to use software PTT on the rig control port if you don't want to keep switching the menu back and forth. 7850 and 51, we use this exclusively at K3LR for all of our contest CW keying. And it's very reliable. There's no win key, there's no external keyers, just to plug a paddle into the radio and let the computer and the paddle key the radio. Yaesu FT991, different menus, same idea. They have what they call an enhanced COM port and a standard COM port. And for some reason, they do rig control on enhanced and the CW keying on the standard. FTDX 101, similar story, although I've had a lot of trouble getting CW keying to work on DTR with this rig. I don't know if anybody here has had it. For some reason, I've only been able to get CW keying to work on RTS. TS-890, Kenwood rigs are kind of the opposite. They want you to do logging software on the standard port and keying on the enhanced port. So it gets very confusing. I've had to learn all this stuff. How do I configure my logging program to key CW on the USB cable instead of a separate WIN key or a separate circuit? The idea is you have to check this box that says CW other, same COM port you're using for rig control, or it could be the secondary one. And then you have to hit the set tab, and then you tell it very simply, I'm doing CW on DTR, I'm doing PTT on RTS. You don't need to check any of these boxes about software. It confuses everything. Software PTT means send a command to the radio to key it and unkey it. So that means the radio can stay keyed if you lose communication. So I wouldn't recommend using these options except for the 7300 or a rig where you're sharing the same COM port for RTTY and PTT. WinTest and DXlog.net contest software also have similar dialogues for setting the CW and PTT pins. Now, what about your timing? People have kind of an old wives' tale that, oh, well, the Windows timing isn't good enough to send accurate CW. That was true in the very old early days of N1MM. It's no longer true with N1MM Plus if you do what I'm suggesting here, which is make sure your PC is set for maximum performance. To save power, Windows will by default use something called a balanced power mode. If you have a laptop, you might see a control like I've shown down here in the yellow arrow. And this might be, the slider here might be, this slider might be set in the middle of the range. You want to slide it all the way to the right, best performance. Otherwise, it slows down the CPU and you can have CW timing issues, also RTTY timing issues. If you have a desktop PC, you need to go to the power options and you want to create a high performance power plan. You might not see it listed. The default is usually this balance plan, which will slow down your CPU and can cause timings. But for ham radio rigs, I think you're going to always want high performance while contesting. If you don't see it, you can create a new power plan in this dialog. I don't know if there's too many folks on this list who are into RTTY contesting or RTTY with MMTTY, but briefly, to make it work with most devices, you need to use the EXT-FSK or EXT-FSK64 rather than the port number. Otherwise, MMTTY won't be able to open it. You go to the radio command button. You want to make sure you're not opening any other COM port so there's no conflicts. Everything to clear here, nothing checked here. And then you tell it you're keying on this by serial port TXT pin. You click this USB port option, make sure you always set it to limiting speed, and then MMTTY will be happy. And then finally, after you close that dialog, a new one pops up, and you tell it I'm doing my FSK keying not on TXT, but on the DTR pin and PTT on the RTS pin. And that's how you set up MMTTY for FSK ready keying, so you don't have to worry about RFI getting into your transmit audio line. You have to use a USB sound card for transmit and try to get all the levels right. I like FSK keying because it's just on and off in the radio, and the radio does the rest. Sometimes you want to share a serial port and there might be conflicts. You can't really use a simple Y connector and parallel two RS-232 ports devices to one RS-232 port, because the TXT line is that's pin 3. It's going to swing between like plus 6 volts and minus 6 volts. So if you put two of them in parallel, they're going to cancel each other out. So you can't do that. Normally, a PC will send commands on pin 3 to the radio, the TXT pin, like what frequency you're on, and the radio will send a response on pin 2 saying I'm on this frequency. And multiple devices can listen in parallel on pin 2. Some rigs have an auto info mode that you can will provide frequency data automatically to a device like a step-IR controller or a band decoder. And a lot of baby loop controller is another one. The SPE Elecraft ICOM amplifiers, they can also monitor the RxD line. So you can put all of those in parallel with no worries, as long as one program is polling or you have the auto info mode turned on. However, the RFKit amplifiers, they want to do their own polling. And I'm not sure about the Antenna Genius, the Power Genius XL. I am trying to figure that one out, see if it will work like the RFKit, or if it'll work in listen-only mode like the Elecraft ones. Listen-only mode amps and devices are great because you can parallel as many of you want to the one serial port on the rig, let the PC do the work. But RFKit won't work with something like an FTDX 5000 or a K3 because it only has one serial port, and even a K3S with a USB connector effectively just has one serial port. So to solve that problem, if you forgive a shameless plug here, I did create something called the serial box, or S-box, and have a USB model that has a built-in FTDI USB to serial adapter. And what it allows you to do with standard cables instead of custom cables, because all the jumper wires inside the box define what goes to what pin, you can connect in parallel step-IR controllers, ACOM and SPE amps, and so on to one serial port on your rig along with your PC. And it does the proper parallel wiring of the RxD lines and only one connector to the TXT. Very flexible inside. And I also included 4 of those keying circuits that I showed you originally with the schematic, so that if you have a rig that does not support CW and PTT keying on its USB cable, including all the ones I've listed here, you can have the same effect of one serial port, one COM port being used for both rig control and CW keying. What about using software to share serial ports? It's possible to do that instead of using a hardware. Some will work properly, like VE3NEA's OmniRig software, because it was designed for radios. And it can be used by all of these software, but unfortunately, N1MM and N3FJP, they refuse to support it. And therefore, you can't use those programs. Otherwise, every program that uses OmniRigs can all run at the same time. They all think they have access to the radio. And in actuality, OmniRig does, and it takes care of acting like a traffic cop. And so it prevents any collisions or conflicts between applications. But this type of keying is not supported when you use OmniRig port. There's another program out there by N4PY called Pegasus Plus, and it allows you to share a COM port with up to 5 other applications in a nice way. What about using the more generic drivers like VSPE or VSP Manager, COM0Com, and I think for Flex radios, there's something called SmartCat or something. You know, they may work, but you know, they're not really designed to know when the beginning and end of a command is. They're not looking for semicolons or anything like that. They're just spitting data to the device. So if you have two programs that try to send commands to the radio at the same time, they're going to just jumble up together, I think, in one big string. And you won't end up with a proper, the command will be ignored because it'll look like garbage to the radio. So those can work in some instances, especially if you're not running more than one program at a time. But if you are, then there can be reliability problems. Some radios have both a USB and a 9-pin connector, like the Elecraft K3S and the FTDI 3000, but you have to pick one in their menu option. You have to say, cat select is our USB or cat select is RS-232. And other radios, the newer ones, they operate independently. So there's no conflicts if you connect something to both ports. That includes the Yaesu and Kenwood and the Elecraft K4 USB is totally independent of the serial port. And the ICOM rigs, which have a USB cable, all but the IC705 also has a CIV connector, which is a 2-wire serial connection, their proprietary CIV bus. And they mostly will operate independent of each other. You can use different baud rates on each, but you have to set this menu option of USB CIV port to unlink from remote. Remote is what they label their CIV connector. You want to unlink those two so that they operate independently and are no longer in parallel. And that way you can have two devices pulling the radio at the same time, maybe a PC on the USB port, and maybe a step-by-R controller or an amplifier pulling the radio on the USB port or the CIV, on the DE9 RS-232 port or on the CIV remote connector. So we're getting close to the end here. A little bit more about sound cards. When you connect any radio which has a USB cable that I'm familiar with, they will, by default, look to Windows like a brand new sound card you're plugging into the PC, and it's going to be called a USB audio codec. And it's ideal to use for digital modes like FT8 and for audio recording of your radio or voice keying to your radio. But sometimes you end up with multiple ones and you want to know which one's the radio because they all called USB audio codec. So you right click on the little speaker icon on the Windows taskbar and you open the sound settings. You can also, there'll be an extra entry that is not shown here called sound, which will get you directly to things. And you want to get to the sound control panel. And I think they've recently updated Windows 10, so you don't have to, they made it easier to get to this thing. There's a couple of ways to do it. You can either look for the word sound control panel over here, or it'll be down here, depending on how wide your screen size is. But a faster way is just hit the Windows key, like a shift key, and then R for run, and then type in multimedia system.control panel, mmsys.cpl, and it launches your neighborhood friendly Windows sound control panel, which is really what you wanted to get to. And when you do that, you will see that after you plugged in your radio USB cable for the first time, that Windows said, oh, that's a brand new sound card. You must want to use that as the default sound card for all my Windows sounds and all Windows music and everything else. Absolutely not. So you will see this green check mark here indicating what is the default recording and playback device. You want to move that check mark down to, or up, in this case, it's in the right place, to the Realtek, the sound card that's connected to the PC speakers. You don't want the sound card and the radio to be the default Windows, where all the dings and beeps and everything will get transmitted over the air. So go to the recording tab, you can click properties. But if you're on this tab and you want to know, well, which one's my radio? I see 3 USB audio codecs. Very simple. Just unplug the USB cable from the radio or from the PC, and one of them will disappear. And then you put it back on and it comes back again. And now you know, okay, that one is my radio. And then you can label it. So as I mentioned, it'll disappear and reappear. You go to the properties button and you can change both the settings under the recording and playback tabs, and then click apply. So here I've relabeled the microphone device. It said USB audio codec microphone. Here I've relabeled it to IC7610. So I know that that's what that rig is. And then I click apply. And I also like to change the little icon so it doesn't look like a microphone. You can click this change icon button right here. Where'd it go? This change icon button, and that pops up this dialog, and you can pick something that looks kind of like a radio, and now you got a reminder, okay, that's my radio, as a visual reminder. So summarizing what you've heard tonight, you want to use the Windows Device Manager to renumber your COM ports. Don't let big gaps appear. Don't let your COM port numbers go crazy. Otherwise, you'll never remember what they are. Always uninstall those prolific devices and their drivers. Always get rid of them. You want to change the FTDI default options, and you may have to do it after a Windows update, a major Windows update, not every one. Considering you can think about labeling your COM ports using the Registry Editor. Those labels may go away, but if you take a screenshot, you can remember what to put them back. And try my recommendation to simplify everything. Instead of using a Win key for CW, use the built-in facility of your radio's USB cable to do it. It's much simpler and more reliable. And again, I recommend DTR for CW or FSK and RTS for PTT. And if you have any conflicts or you can't figure out what COM port is being used by, use the Process Explorer. And again, label your USB audio codec devices. So a reference to this is on my QRZ.com page. After Dayton, I'll be uploading these exact slides. There's older versions up there. One of the links got broken, but I'm trying to get that fixed. But if you can't find it or can't get to it, just email me. Your USB device viewer program is there and the Windows Process Explorer. And of course, my serial box, if you have an older radio and you want to get modern keying methods to work with it, or you want to have multiple devices tracking it, I'm happy to provide that. And of course, you can always email N6TV@ARRL.net. It's working again. It stopped working last Friday, but after finally getting the right person at ARRL, it now works again. All right. Let's open it up for any questions, any slides I can go back to.